Hello and welcome to Conversations with Ruth. I am Ruth. I am also known as Notorious RVG. During the time I worked with ACLU, I encountered legal aid attorneys and was always impressed with their dedication and good work. I realized that I do not know much about legal aid of North Carolina. I have wondered what legal aid really is. How is legal aid able to serve all those that are eligible for its services? That legal aid not only provides services in specific areas, but to target populations, such as veterans, seniors, Native Americans, and victims of trafficking. Equally important is, what are the services legal aid provides? Well, to answer those questions, I ask that you join me in a series of interviews about getting to know legal aid of North Carolina. I promise you that I and you together, we will learn what legal aid is and what services it provides. Welcome to Conversations with Ruth. I am Ruth, Justice Ruth. The episode today is part of our series, Getting to Know Legal Aid. Today we're going to be talking about housing. Legal aid's commitment to preserve housing, to protect people who are homeless. And especially today we're going to be talking about subsidized housing. These are the programs that the government sponsors and subsidize rent to help people obtain affordable housing. I am told that last year legal aid handled about 3,000 cases in this area. So I have a few questions in my quest to find out what legal aid is about. And I'd like to know what services legal aid provides in this area. To help us maneuver through this area, we have as our guest Kelly Clark. Ms. Clark is an attorney with legal aid. She has been working with legal aid for about 16 years. Ms. Clark, we are delighted to have you here. It's a pleasure to see you and know you. I am aware that you also handle some fair housing cases. In fact, I have followed some of those cases. So let's start with subsidized housing first. Okay. In my introduction, I mentioned that these are involve programs sponsored by the government to subsidize rent and help people obtain affordable housing. Is that about right?
Yes, and when you're talking about subsidized, what we're saying is that based on the tenant's income, they can receive some assistance from the federal government, some also from state agencies, to help them pay their rent based on their income. So the tenant's generally paying some, or it's based on their income, what their rent will be.
All right, and I'm sure there's a little bit more detail on that, but that in essence is fine. Mm-hmm. Tell me, what are the most common programs in this area?
Well, one of the most common, or when people think about subsidized housing, they maybe think about public housing, and mm-hmm. that's where the assistance stays with the building. And then for assistance that goes with the tenant into the private market, those are called vouchers. Most people have heard of Section 8 vouchers, but there's a whole variety of different vouchers. For instance, vouchers for veterans, where you have the Department of Housing and Urban Development involvement along with the VA and so forth. And then there's rural development housing. That's with the United States Department of Agriculture. And there's also low-income housing tax credit property. And that's where there have been tax credits that have been funded by the IRS that help with the development with private developers with housing. There's also a program with HUD, the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, called project-based housing that operates like public housing in the sense that the subsidy or the assistance stays with the building and not when the tenant then leaves the property. So those are, I think, the major players and the major actors when you're talking about subsidized housing.
For the people seeking help in this area, what are their main worries, their main concerns?
In the area of subsidized housing, I think it can be a variety. It can be getting a notice and not understanding the notice, because there's a lot of rules and regulations that apply to these properties that tenants have to adhere to, as well as the landlord. So it may be a tenant's getting a notice that they don't understand, where they supposedly have not followed these rules. It could be also a notice of eviction, a notice to terminate the subsidy as well. Those will be, I think, are primarily the cases that we see coming in. It can also be that repairs aren't being done. And you're going to get that in public housing, potentially, if repairs aren't being done. You can also get it in the voucher situation, where in the voucher it's the tenant, you have a landlord, a private landlord, and then you have an agency that's administering the voucher that's generally funded by HUD or some other agency. And so maybe the landlord's not doing the repairs.
I see. Yeah. And when let's say a tenant from public housing contacts legal aid, what kind of services can they expect? What's going to happen?
Well, at the very initial stage, the case will be open for potentially some assessment, which can include just investigation, because there are a lot of cases that come in. And as always with anything with legal aid, since the beginning of time, since the 60s when we first were created, there's not enough resources for the cases and the need.
That is true.
So, the case will be open for assessment, and that's assessment as to the merits of the case, as well as what resources are out there to assist the potential client.
So those 3,000 people I mentioned that were helped last year, all of them receive, at the very least, advice from an attorney?
My understanding is yes. It's whether it's advice that they have a case or they don't have a case. The case is first when people can get into our helpline and through our centralized intake. The case will be open to see if the person meets our income and asset requirements, and then it will be looking at the case facts to see if there is a meritorious claim or there's something that can be done, and then there can be advice given at that stage.
Okay. And if the case is meritorious, as you mentioned, then that person will get legal representation, extended representation?
Not always, no. And that's going to depend on the resources of the office. Now, because we don't have, we have wonderful attorneys and wonderful paralegals and wonderful advocates at Legal Aid, but there's a huge need. And so we also have volunteer lawyers that volunteer with Legal Aid, so that if the local office can't take the case on for representation, generally then we'll see if we can refer the case to a volunteer lawyer who might be able to take the case on.
So let me go back a little bit to make sure I'm following. If representation is provided by Legal Aid or a volunteer attorney, what does it entail in that representation?
Well, if you're dealing with, for instance, a notice of eviction, and let's say there's grounds to fight that, legal grounds to fight that. All cases in North Carolina for eviction are brought in initially in small claims court, and that's where most people, if they have any idea about it, it's like people's court, what you would see on TV, right? It's not supposed to be generally, people can go and represent themselves, but if it's an eviction and there are resources to do it, that's where you might see a legal aid attorney or a volunteer private attorney that's taken a case on at that stage. After that, if the case doesn't go the way that we hope that it goes, it can be appealed to district court. And that's where it's a brand new case, starts anew, and there can be representation there.
So the legal aid attorneys could go to small claims, district court, if the case is appealed.
That's right.
And if there's other levels of appeal, it is possible.
Right. After that level will be if representation is provided and approved by our office. It could even be up at the North Carolina Court of Appeals and beyond.
Yeah. Ms. Clark, I also have learned that legal aid puts a lot of resources in community education. And this is one area where tenants benefit from education. What kind of community education are handled by legal aid in this area?
It comes in a variety of forms. One, it can be clinics that the local offices will put on. We also have some trainings that we can do via Zoom, so that we can be, through our media, a place that maybe it's an attorney on one end and the client is somewhere else in an area, in either in a rural area, where there can be some training as to that. We also go to, for instance, like at domestic violence shelters to do trainings about the housing rights that domestic violence survivors have, particularly when it comes to evictions, or if they're being told they are breaching the lease because they've called the police too many times or so forth. We also we've developed materials, packets for people to be able to read and to understand what it's like, for instance, what to expect when you go to court in small claims, or what are your rights when it comes to housing. And so those are some of the forms that we do.
To provide information and education.
That's right.
Well, thank you, Ms. Clark. I think that's all the time we have. For those that are watching, I want to thank you, and I also want to invite you to view some of our other episodes about getting to know legal aid. Ms. Clark, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Justice Ginsburg.